Here we are back again, looking at more of Richard Wolff, the supposedly most prominent Marxist on the planet. He's definitely an expert in the field, so I was a little disappointed last time when his analysis was basically, well, I wouldn't hire you unless you give me enough value through your work that it's profitable for me. That was the depth of his analysis, and that basically means that every consensual interaction in an economy must have a winner and a loser, therefore exploitation is bad, and it exists. So that was pretty disappointing. We'll see. This one's a little longer. We've got more substance here. We're going to be talking about the end of capitalism, which is a pretty spicy one. So let's get right into it. Firstly, I'd like to get a definition out of the way. More of a lack of a definition from the Marxist side, but it's still something we need to talk about. You're going to hear the word capitalism a lot, quite a bit through this video, but what do they actually mean by capitalism? Well, I'll give my definition quickly. That would be something like the protection of private property rights and the enforcement of contracts. Is pretty basic. Dr. Wolff's definition is very different. When he talks about capitalism, you should understand, to him, he means the system of capitalism, in which the capitalist provides capital and the worker provides labor. In this system, government action seems to be included, meaning that to him, capitalism includes things like tariffs, regulations, and laws that limit choices within the economy. I'd say this difference in definitions is one of the key reasons why discussions with Marxists about capitalism never really work out. When someone who is an advocate for free markets talks about capitalism, what they're really talking about is choices and allowing people to make their own choices. What a Marxist is talking about is the entire system as a whole. They're just two completely different things. They're both about economics, and they're both about, I suppose, how we organize our economies, but they're completely different ideas as far as what they actually mean. So the difference is one of the reasons I try not to actually use the word capitalism on its own so much. I prefer to say things like free market capitalists or just free markets instead. Using the terminology of your, I don't want to say opponent, but I guess it's the right word, when it means different things is not going to work out well for you.
Because I went to the elite universities of the United States, I know many of the leading economists in the United States. Right wing, left wing, and in the middle. And we get together sometimes for coffee or to talk. And we do not agree on how the United States got into this current situation. And we do not agree on what to do about it. But the interesting thing is we agree on the following sentence. This is the worst condition of capitalism in our lifetimes. And I think that's a very significant comment.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree that capitalism is in its worst condition of our lifetimes. I'm not really sure. He's quite a bit older than me, obviously, but again, I mean, I've only been paying attention for a little while, and I'd say it looks pretty bad right now. There's quite a few issues with it at the moment. But where we would disagree, Dr. Wolff and I, is why it's in its current state. Richard would, of course, claim that the issue is the exploitation of labor.
And how do you get that, eh? By exploiting the workers, by hanging on to outdated imperialist dogma which perpetuates the economic and social differences in our society. If there's ever going to be any progress...
Dennis, there's some lovely filth down here!
Since what other answer do Marxists really give? The exploitation of labor is, in their view, the root cause of all economic issues. My criticism of the current state of capitalism is that the government is too far involved, and this leads to unfair advantages for those who can purchase politicians and work the system or know how to do these things, as well as a general misallocation of resources caused by the state being so bad at making decisions. We see this in terms of our healthcare in Canada. You know, if people were using their own money and purchasing insurance with their own money, they'd be doing a much better job of purchasing good insurance and purchasing good goods and services. Good goods. They'd be doing a much better job than the government does. it's pretty clear, just given the wait times and the general quality of healthcare in Canada, that has been declining as much as it has been.
Well, what are the conditions that people point to? I think there are three. One is the explosive importance of the end of the Soviet Union, of the changes in the People's Republic of China, and in this following way, that it opened to Western capitalism, the capitalism of Western Europe, North America, and Japan, an immense new working class, an immense new hundreds of millions of people able and willing and eager to work as employees of capitalist companies. In a simple way, it changed the balance between the employer class, concentrated industrial power in Western Europe, North America, and Japan on the one hand, and an increased mass of well-trained, low-paid workers. And all that we have seen, at least in the last half century, has been the working out of this radical, different situation as the capitalists have made an enormous amount of money, basically by figuring out how to take advantage of this enormous new mass of poor but capable workers. Some capitalists did it by bringing in immigrants, low-wage, desperate immigrants to their home countries. Other capitalists did it in the reverse way, moved their production out of the old centers of capitalism into China, India, Brazil, etc. And this is a major change. And the reason it plunges capitalism into a structural crisis is that while it makes a very small number of people very, very wealthy, because basically they're substituting low-wage workers for higher-wage workers, it also presents itself as a fundamental crisis for the mass of the working class in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, because they are being told, you are going down to the level that the third world was, because we're moving production into the hands of these third world workers.
So it may be true that an increase in supply of labor has benefited the top earners more than the rest of us, the average consumers in the West, but that doesn't mean that the benefit is exclusive to them. If we didn't have the cheap labor, we would be paying much higher prices for the goods we do buy. Apple would not be able to sell iPhones for half as cheap as they do right now if they did not have the Chinese labor market and other labor markets. I think some of the parts are made in like India. But whatever, they need access to these cheap labor to build iPhones for as cheap as they can. So they wouldn't be able to sell as cheap, and our clothes, again, would also be much more expensive. You know, everyone gets after Nike for having what they call sweatshops, but it's like, well, if people are willing to work for that, then the real question we should be asking is, why is their labor worth so little that they're willing to work for basically nothing in some sweatshop? I mean, addressing that issue is more important than just saying, well, Nike, you're not allowed to employ these people even though they want to be employed by you. Same with TVs and basically anything else that has anything produced in foreign countries where labor is cheaper, which is almost everywhere. It's also important to understand that for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, foreign cheap labor is not taking the place of Western human labor, but instead replacing what would be machine labor or automated labor. The average worker can already out-earn what they would be making by pulling a lever in a factory, so they do other more complicated and valuable jobs that earn them higher income. The low-skill, low-pay jobs are now either done by machines or by cheap labor abroad. The real issue for Western workers, which certainly are going through their own problems, one, a refusal to adapt. If you think that you are you have some right to a factory job or to work in an automotive plant, but no one is willing to pay you to do that, then you need to adjust your own expectations for what's going to be happening. The other would be government overreach, either in the form of high taxes, the minimum wage, or unnecessary regulations that make hiring more difficult and more expensive. The insinuation that the Western working class is moving down to where the third world used to be is, quite frankly, a ludicrous statement. Do you worry about whether you'll be starving to death or not? No, of course not. You go to the soup kitchen, or you go to the food bank if you need to. At worst, you can dumpster dive, but that's very rare, and that's basically reserved for the mentally ill. Have you ever seen, or I shouldn't say have you ever, but do you see a quarter of young people dying before they reach adulthood? No. That'd be crazy. Every time someone who is young like that dies, it's a tragedy. And in fact, any time someone who dies at 40, it's very uncommon and quite sad. To say that Canada or anywhere in the West is heading towards third world living standards is kind of insane. The only group that's had a decline in life expectancy is white men, and that's mainly because of opioid overdose, not because we can't afford food. So his claim that we're heading towards third world status is just kind of crazy. Not really sure why he'd even say that. Maybe second world, if you wanted to make the argument, he could try, but even then, that's pretty insane, since real incomes aren't really deteriorating. It's our income isn't really going up, but the stuff that we can buy and the quality of the goods is going up. So still, living standards are increasing, just not as quickly as they were. Dr. Wolff is taking advantage of the fact that it's very difficult to see the entire picture as an individual. He knows that the only reason he has a smartphone is because of Chinese labor, and wherever else they're being made. And he knows very well that the difference in prices more than makes up for the lost wages in the West. But he's got an agenda, so he will knowingly lie about it to help his own argument. We know that he's aware of this because he's clearly studied economics. He's got a PhD in economics, so he's definitely done the research here. He's just ignoring it.
This has not been planned. This has not been explained to the mass of workers, so they are constantly confronted by a deterioration of the social welfare system, social democracy in Europe, of the old New Deal arrangements in the United States that came out of the 1930s. And so you have a working class very much more agitated, very anxious, very worried. And I think you see that in the movement to the right politically in Germany, the support for Le Pen in France, the anger of the French working class against the Socialist Party because it hasn't helped them, the vote for Mr. Trump here in the United States, the vote for Bernie Sanders. For the first time in 50 years, an American politician can take the name socialist and millions of people vote for him. All of these are signs of the failure of this system to manage the transition to extraordinary wealth for the top 5%.
Again, we see Richard taking advantage of how difficult it is to see the whole picture. He talks about the deterioration of social welfare in Europe and the New Deal in the US, and says that this is the reason for people being disenfranchised, the loss of these things. He's doing his best to point out the loss of what he and other leftists have convinced people are best for them, despite the fact that the New Deal was one of the most disastrous economic movements in U.S. history. Dr. Wolff wants you to believe that the government giving you free stuff is what its job is, and that it's good at it. In reality, the government redistribution most hurts the people who it's supposed to be helping. After all, a check will pay your rent for a month, but a job will pay your rent for the rest of your life. Quickly on the subject of Bernie, we need to understand he's not really a socialist. Again, Richard knows this, and that's why instead of saying that people voted for a socialist like Bernie, he says that millions will vote for someone who calls himself a socialist. Bernie is what you'd call a social democrat. Not a social liberal, that's different. Someone who believes in some private ownership, very little in his case, but believes in high corporate and personal income taxes so the government can pay for all essential services. Think France. Canada is moving in this direction, definitely becoming more socialist with healthcare and The welfare benefits in Canada have just been skyrocketing recently, so we are moving there. But yeah, Bernie is not a socialist by any means.
The second cultural structural problem is no way to handle the political impact. In other words, if you make a tiny group of people, relatively speaking, 5% or whatever the number is, very, very wealthy, and you plunge the mass of people into a declining, frightening situation, you are going to have political explosion. You have to manage that, or else it will defeat you. This is the same problem as going back into the 19th century when you make the transition from agrarian feudalism into industrial capitalism. You're going to destroy many institutions. You're going to create all kinds of upheaval, and capitalism was almost overthrown, whether you look at the revolutions of 1848 or of 1870 or the Paris Commune or the revolutions after World War I. This was a mass of workers disturbed by what was going on who almost got rid of capitalism.
This part is just classical Marxist class warfare. Richard, who is part of the 5% but sees no problem with him being part of this 5%, wants to make sure that the working class dislikes the rich people. Other than himself, of course, by the way. He's a good guy because he's, in favor of them. Not in any actual sense, but he wants them to believe that. So time and time again, we see socialists and Marxists tip their hand. They just hate rich people, so they constantly attack them on moral grounds as opposed to actual facts-based arguments.
You're now facing the other side of that problem. The rich, knowing that the mass of people are angry, have decided to manage the situation by buying the political system, by literally taking it away from any democratic foundation because too dangerous for them. But what that does is it makes the mass of people not only have economic problems getting worse, but cannot look to the political system for any kind of solution here. So they try wild things. They vote Brexit, or they vote Trump, or they vote Beppe Grillo, or whatever it is that is maybe something, even if it's strange and odd, that maybe gets them out of a dead end.
Yeah, nice job flipping cause and effect there, Richard. He's claiming that the purchasing of politicians is a response to the unrest of workers, but the purchasing of politicians is actually what's causing the issues facing the working class. The root cause here is the ability of the government to force people to do, anything they don't want to do. If the government has the ability to use force in the economy, we create a huge incentive for the rich to buy them. I put that in quotations because they're not really buying them, but I think you get what I'm saying. And in a situation where it is possible to buy politicians, one is more or less forced into doing so by the fact that one's competitors can also do so. So if you are in a situation where you can influence politics through money, that means that other people are also in this situation. And so if you don't do it, they will. At this point, you'll just be losing out for no real reason. The influence is going to happen anyway, so it might as well be you who does it from the perspective of a business owner / CEO. The solution is the opposite of what Dr. Wolff wants. If we take away the government's power to force anyone to do things they don't want to do, as long as there is no negative externality being created, we'll have a much more fair playing field for workers and owners.
Last thing. In the places to which capitalism moved, that's China, India, Brazil, there you have again the problems of 19th century European capitalism. It's a new capitalism. It's transforming this society. It is moving hundreds of millions of people off of the land into the cities and industry, and it is driving these people crazy, and they have their own tensions, and it's not clear that the people running those societies can manage it. So whether you are in the areas to which capitalism is gone and is growing, or whether you're in the areas that capitalism is abandoning, you have a level of tension between the controllers and the controlled that makes it impossible to know whether this is going to be a phase or whether it might be a system that can't handle the contradictions it has itself brought into being.
Yeah, there isn't really much in this third point, honestly. As far as I can tell, the crux of his argument is that people are being forced into cities against their will, and that this is bad. Well, if people are being forced into cities against their will, then there's only one of two possible things that are happening. Either the government is doing it themselves, by sending soldiers to make people move, or they're doing such a terrible job of protecting the rights of their citizens that a corporation is literally sending armed people to move citizens into the city. Either would be a pretty crazy thing, and either would be more a problem with their government than anything else. The alternative is that people are moving into the cities on their own accord, in which case there's basically nothing to see here. We know that people will do what they see as best for themselves, either directly or indirectly, and whether they're right or not is not the point here, but they will always do what they feel is best for themselves. So, if they're choosing to move into the city because they believe it's what's best for themselves, then who are we to say they should not be allowed to do this? Just saying that the quality of life is low in developing countries, like it was in Britain during the Industrial Revolution, doesn't mean that life is getting worse. It just means that conditions are bad. It's likely that capitalism is improving the quality of life in developing nations. In fact, it most definitely is. But by comparing their quality of life to ours, Richard is able to make it look like things are terrible in these countries because of capitalism, or what he calls capitalism. More Marxist sleight of hand aimed at radicalizing the uninformed.
Well, a few minutes ago I said I wouldn't predict, and now I'm going to make a little prediction. I have not been a person who thinks capitalism is collapsing. I haven't been part of that kind of, because I don't believe in this sort of prediction business. But I will tell you that I don't see a way out. I don't see a return to capitalism concentrated in its old centers. I believe Mr. Trump, who has a desire to do that here in the United States, will not succeed in this process. He has too many enemies, which include the business community, which is not going to let him do that, I would guess. Or to put it another way, if he succeeds, the destabilization of Europe and Japan will be staggering. And it will, if he succeeds, it will be at the expense of the rest of the world. And in that way, it has parallels with German history in the 1930s and 40s also. You cannot solve these problems inside. It has effects everywhere else, and it mobilizes the whole world against you. And that's the same risk that the United States faces, and it hasn't learned anything from German history at all. Doesn't even know what that history is. So,
What the fuck are you talking about? Trump has had the backing of businesses when he's doing things that are good for the economy. Well, more specifically, those businesses. Like when he reduced taxes. All the companies, all the corporations basically said, yeah, this is great, we want lower taxes. When he was tariffing steel, the steel producers were like, hell yeah, let's do that. Now, the tariffs, I wouldn't say are good for the economy as a whole, so I disagree with Trump there. But when he's doing things that the business owners like, they're into it. They don't hate him like you, just because he's Trump. That's what leftists do, not normal people. The idea that if the U.S. is able to reform their economy, that will be a negative for the world is kind of a foolish idea. How does one country lowering taxes hurt other nations? It might expose the terrible policies of Europe, Canada, and Japan, but it does not directly hurt them. They're being hurt by their own policies. If lowering taxes works out for the U.S., which so far it seems to be, then other countries just have to do the same so they can regain some of the capital that moves to the U.S. Investors just want to make the most efficient use of their capital as they can. And if the most efficient place to invest is the U.S., because it has low taxes and fewer regulations, then they will go there. But if Canada lowers taxes and regulations to be competitive with the U.S., investors will be perfectly happy to bring their capital back to Canada. Competition between countries for capital is a good thing. If the U.S. can reform properly, they will force the rest of the world to do better or suffer the consequences.
I am closer to believing than ever in my life that the system has now produced a network of problems that it cannot solve, or at least that I don't see solutions emerging that can begin to manage this level of difficulty. If, again, to use our example in America, if Trump proceeds to, for example, threaten the export economies of India, China, and Brazil, we will be in a situation which in the past in human history has gone from a trade war to a military war, and then all calculations make no difference anyway. So in that sense, I guess I am pessimistic. On the other hand, I do think there is emerging a new direction for those of us who think that the solution is not this or that law or regulation or international agreement, but that we are at a point of systemic crisis, and that therefore the only rational solution is to think about what alternative system could be established that would have a different set of problems that are more manageable than the problems of capitalism, which I don't think are manageable.
Yeah, again, I don't see why U.S. policy matters so much to foreign nations. Their problems are mostly self-created as far as economics are concerned. They're not the fault of the U.S. On the subject of a new system that would replace what Dr. Wolff refers to as capitalism, how about we try not using force to make people do things they don't want to do? Why not, instead of giving the government more power, which will absolutely be necessary for any sort of transition away from private ownership, we try allowing people to make their own decisions. Of course, the elitist left could never possibly abide by this, since after all, they know what's best for you better than you do.
And here, the left, of which I'm a part, has to be able to be not only critical of capitalism and its dead end, but also of the socialist history out of which we come. And here, I would say as simply as I can, the socialism that comes out of the 19th century and that dominated in the 20th century was in its way very successful.
The only thing that 19th century socialism was successful at was oppressing its own citizens in a way that allowed its ruling class to justify its own opulence. The countries with the biggest wealth disparities are socialist countries, especially communist countries. Wherever you see government intervention, you see a proportional disparity emerge. In Canada, a mixed economy, we see a shrinking middle class, but not nearly as pronounced as in Cuba, a fully socialist economy. If you want equality, vote for less intervention, not more.
But insufficiently profound. That is, it was a socialism that said the problem with capitalism is private ownership of the means of production and markets. So that what we will have is a new system with public ownership of the means of production and government planning. Public ownership and planning versus private ownership and markets. What that ignored was the organization of the workplace, where each of us goes 5 or 6 days of the week from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. That's where we spend most of our adult lives, at work. If you do not transform the workplace, your efforts to transform the rest of society won't work, because they will be held back, they will be undone by the unchanged nature of the workplace. And to be simple about it, I don't think in the Soviet Union, and I don't think in the People's Republic of China, you made the transformation. What would that transformation be? Well, before I tell you, the answer, which I will give you in a minute, is the new direction, is the new system, which I think is where we're going and which can perhaps solve our problem. The answer is you have to revolutionize the workplace because it wasn't done before. Whatever you think about government ownership or state enterprises or planning has to be rethought in terms of what it would look like if it were built on the basis of a radically transformed work organization. So here's what it would look like. And here in the United States, we use the term, because it's more comfortable in people's minds, of worker co-op. And what it simply means is every workplace changes. The decisions of the workplace are now to be made democratically. One worker, one vote. And in each enterprise, in a factory, in a store, in an office, the workers collectively decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. This is the democratization of the workplace. It is a radical change in how all workplaces will be organized. It gives every worker the role not only of employee, but also of employer. It destroys the foundation of capitalism, which divides people into a small number of employers and a huge number of employees. It is the end of capitalism, in the same way that liberating the slave was the end of the slave economy, of liberating the serf was the end of the feudal economy. Liberating the employee, in this case, by transforming him or her into an employer at the same time, is the end of capitalism and will produce another system. And I think if we bring that to the mass of people suffering in a capitalism, they will see this as a revolution that is about them. It's not about giving some distant government all kinds of authority. It's about transforming their own lives and making the government dependent for the first time on a system of democratic control at the base, so that they can have some hope of making it work in their interests rather than the interest of the employer. So for me, I would summarize by saying socialism in the 21st century will be more focused at the micro level of the enterprise than at the macro level of ownership and planning, and that's a necessary rebalancing of the micro and the macro, and therefore corrects what was the limitation of socialism in the 19th and 20th century.
So if these co-ops are going to be so great, why don't you just start one? There's nothing stopping anyone from trying this business model right now. And if it's true that people were happier working in them than working for a capitalist, then wouldn't they be fine with taking the financial hit from joining a co-op? Well, the reality is, whenever these models are tried, the business that attempts it ends up being quite unsuccessful. And if they can't compete with the capitalist business model, then why would we bother switching that on a national level? Another huge issue with attempting this on a national level is the fact that the government would absolutely be necessary in any attempt at reforming to this extent. Unless you could convince every single person in the country that this was the best method for them, you would need the coercive power of the state to pull this off. And if the government would have to seize all private businesses to do this, what makes you think they would ever actually give up their ill-gotten gains? After all, how often do governments actually give up their power willingly? What would be far more likely is a government that says they're going to seize all private businesses so they can redistribute them at a later date, but never actually does so, even if the initial intention was to redistribute the business. Once you centralize power, the people who have it will not be very willing to give it up. What about once you achieve your goal of all businesses being these co-ops? How do you keep it that way? Unless the co-op model proves to be far superior to that of the capitalist model, many people want to go back to the old system of private ownership, so that the only way to keep your socialist utopia will be a strong central government that prohibits the private ownership of business. The co-op idea is nothing but an attempt to convince those who are uneducated on economics into believing that the government really can solve everything. As long as we give them power for just a little while, life will become so much better. The end result will, as it always is, be an oppressive, overreaching state that will be used to benefit the elites at the top at the expense of everyone below. Do not be convinced by Marxists who tell you they want equality. They are lying. All they really want is control over your life so that they can centralize power and wealth for themselves. They believe that they will be part of the new power structure that comes out of the revolution, or in this case, government seizure of power. So they advocate for it, not realizing that the new regime will put a noose around their neck as soon as they can. They must do so, because they already know that these are the people who are able to make change. And once a socialist has power, they won't like change anymore. Well, that's all for this time. Thanks for watching, and if you want more, go ahead and sub. Also, if you have any ideas for topics you would like to see me discuss, or thoughts on this video, go ahead and leave a comment. Have a good one.